Hello, this is Virtualis, the chess noob, here to talk about a game that I played a couple of days ago, the Slav Defence against a Queen's Gambit. Now, I actually love playing the Slav Defence, and it's my go-to defence against the Queen's Gambit, actually. So let's have a look at this game to sort of chess.com. And in this game, look, I was pretty pleased with myself. Accuracy 85%, maybe not so good in the general scheme of things, but I'm not too unhappy. And where I make no blunders, I consider myself have done reasonably well. If you look at sort of the graph, and I made a mistake earlier on, but then the opponent makes some sort of critical error, and I managed to hold my advantage. Let's slip straight to analysis now and let's have a look at this game. So Queen's Gambit, white opens with d4 and the Slav defense is defending the d5 pawn with the c pawn. Usually, white will then develop their pieces, for example, their knight. But the opponent surprised me almost immediately at the beginning of the game with pushing their c-pawn further forward. At this point, I wasn't really sure what was the best response, so I decided just to continue with my usual Slav defense development. So developing the knight to f6, and then the bishop to f5. And interestingly enough, this brings the game to equality, 0-0-0. It's interesting reading the stockfish analysis on what would have been a better move. And I can see that, attacking that pawn, defended by the queen with development. I will do that next time. The opponent develops a long diagonal chain of pawns. I finish my pawn development with my pyramid as per the Slav defense, bishop, knight, and at the end of our mutual development we're basically again equal, 0-0-0. Castles, and here I made my first mistake. I wasn't really sure what was the best way to approach this long diagonal of pawns. I thought maybe I would attack and try to weaken that pawn with that push, with the push of the e pawn to e5. Now, obviously, that's actually pretty, not perhaps the best move, given that it could be captured back. I can't capture given that it's defended by the knight, but I thought I could potentially gambit that pawn and then attack and attempt to recapture their d pawn with the move knight to g4. They capture, which was the best move. I move my knight as before to g4, attacking this pawn, inviting a trade. And it worked. And at the end of this exchange, we're back to 0-0-0. This pawn is now sort of in the middle of nowhere, under attack by the bishop. I was pretty happy with that position. I was pretty sure that this was a bad move by the opponent as it weakens the defense of the king. Didn't realize it was quite that bad, a blunder, and if you remember that graph before, this was the critical error for the opponent. Free pawn, I will oblige. Castles, and my next move here was I thought I could attack that weak e3 pawn, especially now that the f pawn has advanced forward. I saw a potential line for me where I would move the knight to c4, potentially attacking with the bishop. Bishop would defend, knight captures back, forking the rook and queen. I was fairly sure that the opponent would see this and not be happy with that development. So with the knight developed to c4, I was hoping that the opponent would in fact capture with the bishop. I would capture back. I would be left now with the bishop pair after the trade of the knight for the bishop. Queens then see each other, and in this position I was quite happy with a trade of queens as well, as it would help develop my rook. And this is what happened. Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen trade, and in this position I was actually fairly sure I was ahead, and Stockfish agrees. Attack on the pawn and the knight, and I was hoping I'll be able to capture at least one of those pieces. Moving the pawn forward, I contemplating capturing the knight, which Stockfish actually thinks is the best move. However, I wanted to keep hold of my bishop pair at this time, so moved the bishop back to e6, defending the pawn on c4. The knight now potentially forks my bishop and rook, so I need to defend the square on f4 with the bishop. Invitation for a trade. That would be a mistake for me to capture, but I'm not too unhappy with the opponent capturing my bishop, given that it's already defended by a rook and it would move that rook out of a potential fork. I decided to develop my rook to put the rooks in a potential battery, and I was very happy with this transformation. I wasn't particularly perturbed by this, and my goal at this time was to see whether or not I could push that pawn to promotion. Now, that is what I did, but apparently that's a bad move, and retrospectively, that push could have just been prevented with the movement of that rook to c1. That would have been a better move as it's protected by the bishop, but I didn't see that in the game. The opponent makes a blunder, so I was pretty sure that was a terrible move during the game, as it looks like that they will not be able to prevent that pawn moving forward, and I was actually fairly comfortable that in that position they would at minimum be forced to trade one of their rooks for the pawn. The ideal line for me would be rook takes, pawn takes with queen promotion, rook forced to take, and my rook takes their second rook, leaving me with one rook and one bishop versus their remaining knight, and that would be a completely winning endgame for me. The opponent makes the right move, I capture their rook, rook is forced to capture that pawn, otherwise we would end up trading rooks and I would be up a queen. Now I am one full rook up, however they still have a rook and a knight, so I have to play carefully. They still have some counterplay. My goal here was to try to liquidate their pieces if possible, so if I could trade away their pieces, that would put me in a substantial advantage. The opponent of course didn't want to do that, potentially aiming to attack the pawn on g7, however reasonably easy to prevent that by protecting the square on g5. So there's some free pawns here and another free pawn. Happy to oblige. Now to protect that pawn, simple push. Kick the rook out. Defend the pawn. And my goal now was to see whether or not I could promote the b pawn. And now this looked like a scary move and a good move for the opponent, but I calculated that the opponent actually wasn't fast enough to prevent a queen promotion, as we will see. So, captures the rook, promotes to queen, and it almost looks like they are just fast enough with a fork of the bishop and the queen, but because of the geometry here, I get to fork his knight with check, and at the end of that exchange I have a queen, bishop and rook versus one rook, completely winning endgame. The opponent resigns. GG.